I'm not speaking about all of you. I know those I have chosen. But the scripture must be fulfilled. The one who eats my bread has raised his heel against me. I am telling you now, before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. Truly I tell you, whoever receives anyone I send receives me, and the one who receives me receives him who sent me. When Jesus had said this, he was troubled in his spirit and testified, Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. The disciples started looking at one another, uncertain which one he was speaking about. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining close beside Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to him to find out who it was that he was talking about. So he leaned back against Jesus and asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus replied, He's the one I give the piece of bread to after I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son. And after Judas ate the piece of bread, Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, What you're doing, do quickly. None of those reclining at the table knew why he had said this to him. Since Judas was the keeper of the money bag, some thought that Jesus was telling him, Buy what we need for the festival, or that he should give something to the poor. After receiving the piece of bread, he immediately left, and it was night.
Benedict Arnold, Ephialtes, Judas Iscariot, Kevin Durant. These are the names of some of the most well-known traitors in the history of the world. I thought I was really funny by throwing Kevin Durant's name in there. I knew about 10% of you might get it if you follow sports. I was really cracking myself up. I sent this joke to like 5 people already, and you are in here, so I killed the laughs of that. But anyways, I thought it was hilarious. But if you don't know why, I grew up in Oklahoma City. I'm an Oklahoma City Thunder fan, and I don't think you should leave the team that just beat you, to leave to go play for the team that just beat you in the Western Conference Finals. I think he's a traitor. But it is what it is. I promise I've moved on. I don't care. It's just a game. You know, that's how you want to do it to get your championship. Go for it. Anyways, so Kevin Durant's not really a traitor. Whatever. It's a game. But the other people I was mentioning are well-known traitors. Some of you might have recognized those names. Some of you might not have. Those were traitors that weren't just about a game, right? It led to the loss of life. It led to death. It led to pain. Our passage today, as you just heard read, is about one of the most recognizable traitors in all of life. As Kevin said in preaching team, he ruined the name Judas for everybody, right? Like no one names their kid. Well, I don't know. Maybe you did. Sorry if your kid is named Judas. But it's one of those names that we recognize. The betrayal of the Son of God, Jesus the Messiah, by one of his close disciples, Judas Iscariot. Again, I do want to welcome all of you, both in person and online as well. I'm glad to be here, even though it's a little bit of a hybrid model. It's a crazy time right now, but it's way better than last week when I was sitting in my office recording to a camera. I was like being triggered from what we did a couple years ago. I can't believe it's been that long when COVID first started, but we're just managing this together. You guys are incredibly gracious and flexible, and I really do appreciate that. So here at New Eden, we typically preach through books of the Bible. Right now, we're in the Gospel of John. We're going to specifically be in John chapter 13, verses 18 to 30. Now, we've been in the book for some time now. We'll be going through it the next 4 or 5 months, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm excited kind of getting to the close of John. It's exciting. As we go into our passage, one of the things that's important is to be reminded of our context. All the discourse that's happening right here in John chapter 13 is happening the same night and the same time that goes all the way through the end of chapter 17. So 5 chapters worth of content, all taking place in what seems to be a Passover meal that Jesus is having with his disciples. If you remember last week, we looked at Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And we were shown that we're not only saved by the service of Jesus to us, but also saved to the service of Jesus, to the world around us. We're both saved from something and to something. We're sent into the world, and that's what happened. Jesus served his disciples. And so immediately after that story takes place, disciples probably still reeling from the shock of what just happened, Jesus washing their feet, our story picks up today. And so let's go back a couple verses and read to kind of get into the context. John chapter 13, verses 16 through 18 says, "Truly I tell you, a servant is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. So that's how our time ended last week. And then he goes on to say, I'm not speaking about all of you. I know those I have chosen, but the scripture must be fulfilled. The one who eats my bread has raised his heel against me. So Jesus says, not all will be blessed. Jesus is fully aware of those who are his, those he has chosen to serve the world around him. And clearly there is one among this group of 12 that is not the one that he appears to be, that will betray him. And of course, we know he's talking about Judas. Now, our author, if you followed us through the Gospel of John, he's mentioned Judas a couple times. He doesn't hide who Judas is. All the way back in chapter 6, he starts letting us know this is the one who's going to betray him, right? This was an insidious character. Judas was a bad dude. We've already been told that he would take the money bag that he was supposed to be holding on to give to the poor and to care for each other, and he's stealing from it for himself. So this man has greed. He's a thief. He's giving himself over to Satan to do his bidding, and all this has gradually and slowly led up to the most insidious act, which is the betrayal of the Messiah, the chosen one. But what I was struck by as I was studying this passage was that throughout this whole time, Jesus doesn't at all seem to be shocked by what Judas is doing. He's not surprised. It's not a wrench in his plans. It's not going to disturb his path to redeem the world. In fact, Jesus tells us that this was prophesied, that it was going to happen in the scriptures. This betrayal is simply another footnote in the story of Jesus, portrayed as the better king, the better David, the true king of Israel. Jesus quotes when he says, the one who eats my bread has raised his heel against me. He is quoting from Psalm chapter 41. Look at it with me. It'll be on the screens. It says, all who hate me whisper together about me. They plan to harm me, right? We've seen that already with the religious leaders in John. Something awful has overwhelmed him, and he won't rise again from where he lies. This is their excitement. You can hear them saying this post-cross. And then he goes on to say, even my friend in whom I trusted, one who ate my bread, has raised his heel against me. So in the immediate context of Psalm, this was David lamenting what had taken place, but Jesus presents himself as the fulfillment of this psalm. This idea of one eating bread together, I don't know if we understand it fully in our culture, but I think we do somewhat. It's when you have people around your table. I mean, it's an intimate relationship. That's what this described. And it described Judas to a T, right? He ate with Jesus. They dined together. They stayed in the same places. They traveled together, lived with each other for 3 years. Yet still, he lifted up his heel against Jesus. This means that he was raising his foot, intending to kick Jesus, to betray him, and eventually to put his foot on the neck of Jesus, to crush him. Later in verse 27 of our text, we're told that Satan entered Judas. So Judas is fully possessed by Satan. And so Satan is using Judas as a tool to bring the worst attack that he can muster against the Savior of the world. This is the battle. All the way that we saw prophesied back in Genesis 3, this is the battle coming to a head. And as I was just musing on this text, I was struck by the posture of Jesus throughout this whole ordeal. He makes it very clear that Jesus is in complete control of the situation. There's this deep abiding trust in the plan of his Father. Even when there's a clear attack and betrayal, Jesus does not flinch. He is powerful. He is sovereign over the plans of evil. He is in control. And because this is true, because Jesus is in control, I see 4 responses from Jesus in the face of his betrayal. 4 responses that not only give us cause for great hope, but also might challenge us to walk in the same manner as we become more fully formed into Christ likeness. The first response we see Jesus have, we see that Jesus stands in faith. Jesus stands in faith. Look at verse 19. After he prophesies Judas would betray him, he says, I'm telling you it now before it happens. Why am I telling you this? So that when it does happen, you will believe that I am. We've seen I am. Jesus is divine. I am he. Truly, I tell you, whoever receives anyone I send receives me, and the one who receives me receives him who sent me. So Jesus is talking about their union with the Father and with him all being one. But in the face of betrayal, there is this deep abiding faith and belief that all will still work together for good. The path of Jesus to the cross is not some new idea that blindsided him in this moment. It's not some plan B. As Jesus just quoted, this moment of betrayal was prophesied to take place years before. And not only that, we're told that before the foundations of the world ever existed, that God had ordained for himself in the form of Jesus to come down and conquer death by dying on a cross to redeem the world. So when all around him is falling apart, when his hour had come, when his friends don't understand this language of going to die, a Messiah, a Redeemer doesn't come to die. They don't understand when he's all alone, when his close friends betray him, his faith does not waver because he knew it was coming. If anything, his faith was strengthened because it proved that the plan was working as it had meant to work. And I love that. Jesus does the same thing with us. He doesn't hide hard truths from his followers. He tells us up front, suffering will be normal. Persecutions will await you if you follow my path. The world will hate you. Your family might not understand what you are doing. People around you, people who appear to be committed and faithful. I mean, Judas was so trusted that he was the one who carried the money. That's how much nobody expected it to be him. People like that will fall away. And he says, the reason I'm telling you that up front, the reason Jesus tells us that up front is so that when it does happen, we might be encouraged instead of discouraged. And I know it's more nuanced than this. We're going to get to that. But this is so that our faith may be strengthened when the foundation of others around us might be shaken. In 1 John, the same author of our gospel, when he's writing a letter, he says, there's going to be those who appear to be Christians who will walk away from the faith. And that's a sad thing. The exhortation when that happens is to not shrink back, to not lose faith, to press into belief and hope in the sovereign purposes of God that he will work things out for our good and for his glory. This does not mean that doubt will not creep in. This is a difficult situation when this happens. It doesn't mean that there won't be grief. We're going to see that in a moment. But it does mean that when this happens, by the power of the Spirit, we are able to stand in faith. Our trust in the work of Jesus can actually be strengthened, can be deepened, because he told us beforehand, hey, this is how it's going to be. And so when others walk away, when we look at the story of Judas and others in our life, this can stand as both a somber warning and a gracious encouragement. It's a somber warning because when it happens, we are warned to spend time examining our own hearts. Judas received all the benefits of following Jesus. He took communion with Jesus. He dined with him. He ate bread with Jesus. He was involved in all the powerful acts the other disciples did, but he never received the person of Jesus. We can do all the churchy stuff. I did it for years. We can sing the songs, quote the scriptures, pray the prayers, enjoy the fellowship. We can be involved, but none of that is what saves us. It's Christ alone, man. It's only the work of Christ. The question is, have we surrendered and confessed that Jesus is Lord and given our lives to him? Have we done that, or are we only with him insofar as he doesn't disagree with us or our preferences? And there is so much pressure from the world to manipulate Jesus. Sometimes we're embarrassed by the truths that he talks about. So we want to clean them up on his behalf. There's pressure to choose our own way over his. And by the Spirit, my prayer for every single one of you, for me, for my kids, is that we would be held fast in his hand. And so though there is a somber warning, there is also incredible encouragement. If it's true that our salvation does not rest in our work alone, but instead in the finished work of Christ, we can look to the cross and we can move forward with confidence and faith. I love it. The writer of Hebrews, he's encouraging and challenging and telling them to, hey, there's a somber warning, but then he goes on and says, we are not of those who shrink back. Because Jesus is the I am, because he's beat death and hell and the grave, we can stand in faith, not on the basis of our work, not on the basis of any of us, but instead on the work of Christ. He will keep you. He will complete the work that is in you. So we fight the good fight of faith. We hold on to hope, and we know that Christ is holding on to us. But here's the thing. Knowing all this, right? We talk about standing in faith. Knowing that it's going to happen beforehand doesn't make it any easier when it happens. When people betray us, when people walk away from the faith that we love, Jesus doesn't just mechanically walk through the human experience. I love this. He's not just kind of mechanical, like, well, it's going to happen, whatever. He becomes one with us. He understands what it's like to be in our shoes. He feels what we feel. And it leads us to the second response we see from Jesus. He stands in faith, but he also sits in grief. Verse 21, when Jesus had said this, he was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. And I love that the scriptures don't hide the emotions of God. I was reading in Exodus earlier this week when God makes a covenant with Israel, and 40 days into this union they've committed to with him, they cheat on God with a golden calf. And God gets upset, even angry. He's hurt. Wouldn't you? If your spouse cheated on you 40 days into your marriage. I was reminded of that reading this passage. The fact that Jesus is the I am, that he is sovereign and that he is in control, did not change the emotional reality he was facing. He is deeply troubled here. And it's not the only time we've seen it. We've seen him weep when his friends wept. We've seen him angry when he saw injustice or when his message was manipulated. Jesus feels this betrayal. It hurts him. We can understand this. None of us like to be betrayed. By definition, betrayal means that we're done wrong by someone close to us, someone that was supposed to be for us, someone that was supposed to be on our team, our friend. And the closer this relationship is, the more intimate it is, the more it hurts. Many of you can relate to how Jesus might have felt in this moment. Sorrowful, troubling. And we, like Jesus, need to be willing to sit in the grief when we've been hurt. We don't like admitting we're hurt because it means we're not invincible. It means that someone got to us. And the walls we think we've created and the strength that we think we have, it's revealed to not be that great. But Jesus sits in this grief. When we've been done wrong, it's okay to acknowledge it and grieve the loss of a friend or the loss of a relationship, whatever it may be. Like, betrayal hurts. And the beauty of the incarnation and God becoming flesh is that he not only sees from a distance, he is with you in it. For those of you that have been truly and deeply hurt, whether it be by church leaders, by those that claim Christianity, by close friends, or by spouses, God sees, he hears, and he comes down and sits with you in the grief. He is with you in the dark. He's crying the tears alongside you when you're sitting in the room and you feel all alone. You are not abandoned. I will never leave you or forsake you. Even if everyone else does, he will not. Jesus understands. So after he says plainly that one of them will betray him, the disciples are all trying to figure out who it is. Now you might think, well, obviously, they would know if they were going to betray him, but this idea of betrayal could have meant they were going to slip up and let the Roman authorities know where Jesus was, and they could have thought that, so they're all wondering, is it going to be me? Am I going to be the one to mess up? Now there's one in the circle of disciples who's pretty confident he won't. It's Peter. He's always very confident in himself. Next week we're going to see it's pretty unfounded. But in this moment, Peter's like, well, I know it's not me. So hey, John, who's sitting closer next to Jesus, he kind of motions to him. So he's getting his attention. Maybe the disciples have gone back to talking. He's like, hey, who is, ask him. Go ahead. I don't know if you did. I'm the kid in class. I would never do the thing to get in trouble, but I'm like poking the other guy next to me like, hey, this would be hilarious. You should do it. So this is Peter, hey, ask Jesus, right? So John asked Jesus. John was sitting next to Jesus. He leans over and quietly asks Jesus, hey, who are you talking about? So this is how Jesus replies in verse 26. He says, he's the one I give the piece of bread to after I've dipped it. When he had dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son. So at least now there's one other person in the room. I don't know if John was able to communicate this to Peter or not yet, but John is inside on what's going on here. And so the next thing we see that Jesus does, he stands in faith, he sits in grief, and next we see that he eats with sinners. As I was reading this passage, I was struck with how Jesus treated Judas, not only in this story, but throughout his entire ministry. Jesus knows that Judas is stealing from this money bag that was meant to be given to the poor. He knows that he's destined for destruction. That's what he prays in John 17. Yet Jesus still invites him to join in his life. You would think that this betrayal would cause Jesus to cut off the relationship. Jesus has known this is coming, to treat Judas differently, but Jesus presses in even more. This isn't because he trusted Judas, it's because he trusted his Father. The way Jesus radically loved and treated sinners was crazy. Even his enemies. He invites sinners to the table to eat with him, even though they're on their way to betray him. He healed ungrateful lepers alongside the grateful ones. And in Christ, we are empowered to do the same. But often our tendency when we've been hurt, we kind of minimize it. We pretend that it didn't really bother us. We don't sit in the grief. If we admit that it hurt us, we admit that we're not all powerful, so we just become cynical. And we don't allow anybody to get close to us, and we don't put ourselves out there anymore. We keep people at arm's length. I've been hurt before. I've learned my lesson. When people show you who they are, believe them, right? We live in a culture that talks a lot about self-care. I am pro caring for oneself. That's not a bad thing. But we must be careful to not make our self-care self-centered. The goal of being healthy, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, is not just so our life gets more comfortable and easier, so we just cut off all relationships with people that are difficult. Like if the Son of God did that, none of us would be here. The goal of being healthy is so that we may more fully be used to serve and care for others, even those that seek to betray us, those that hate us. This is hard, okay? This can't happen without the power of the Spirit. It's the point of Christianity. I was convicted reading this passage of how impatient I get sometimes with people's spiritual journey. Convicted of how often my love for someone is given out in proportion to the speed of someone's growth as a Christian. And that's like me assuming that I somehow have the corner on being the judge and standard of what Christian maturity is. Or maybe I only love people based on how much they agree with me, right? But Jesus loved and served unconditionally. Because Jesus trusted the work and plan of his Father, he didn't see the need to micromanage his disciples. I mean, I would have put a stop to what Judas was doing very early on. Jesus didn't see the need to control what they did with an iron fist. He didn't see the need to correct every infactual Facebook post they shared. He simply loved them. And I know they didn't have Facebook. I was just making a point. He loved them. Does this mean that there wasn't accountability, correction, speaking in love when needed? No, definitely. Like read the text. But he wasn't constantly worried about it. There was this peace. There was this rest. Even though Judas was headed to betray him. Look what he says in verse 27. He says, after Judas ate the piece of bread, Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, hey man, what you're doing, do quickly. My hour's here. And after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately left, and it was night. This night. Our author has multiple meanings in a statement in the Gospel of John, and here, Satan enters Judas. He leaves, and we see the darkness, the night referenced here. This is a clear attack from Satan on the light of the world. He's trying to put out the promised seed. He's trying to crush Jesus, to raise his foot against him, and Jesus just lets it happen. From an earthly standpoint, it doesn't make sense. Through the lens of this age, you would think that Jesus would just put a stop to what Judas is doing, tell his disciples, hey, we've played this game long enough. It's time for a physical insurrection. Let's go take over the Romans. But Jesus knows something bigger is going on. There's a much bigger redemption at stake. The prophecy in Psalm 41 did not end with the betrayal. Look at it again. Psalm 41:10. But you, Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up. Then I will repay them. By this I know that you delight in me. My enemy does not shout in triumph over me. You supported me because of my integrity and set me in your presence forever. Here in Psalm, we see that hope is coming. Jesus stands in faith. He sits in grief. He eats with sinners. And the last response we see from Jesus is that he presses on with hope. In the midst of the darkest of nights, as he's being betrayed, he tells Judas, simply do what you're going to do quickly. My time is here and I know. In just a few short hours, evil will do its worst. As not only Judas, but political and religious authorities use every bit of power they have, the power of the state, the power of social influence, to unjustly crucify Jesus on a cross as a thief in the most inhumane manner possible. The betrayal of Judas was just a small piece of the pain and agony and grief that Jesus will feel when he goes to the garden and says, Father, is there any way possible? Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. He knows death awaits him. And ultimately, he will be left all alone as he breathes his last on the cross. He would be hung in the darkness. And the enemy would shout in triumph as his conniving plan appeared to have worked. But as we read in the Psalms, he would be raised up because he is the truly powerful one. The enemy does not shout in triumph for long because evil doesn't have the last word. On the third day, Jesus is raised and he will sit in the presence of his Father forever. And even though Satan through Judas tried to lift up his heel and stomp out the light of the world, it is Jesus that puts his heel on the head of the serpent to crush it, just like he said he would do, all the way back in Genesis 3. And all the powers of the world watch as Jesus wins. This is good news for us. In the midst of dark nights, when betrayal hits us in the face, when it seems that evil is winning, there is hope in a weary, hurting world. We all, to one extent or another, have both been betrayed and we've both been the betrayers. And the good news is that in the midst of all this, because Jesus pressed on with hope, he lived and died and rose again, we too can press forward in hope. The gospel is enough to redeem us, both when we've been betrayed. He can redeem our circumstances, and when we've betrayed others, as we walk in repentance and confession, there's good news because he redeems us and covers our sin. For those who trust in Jesus, there is a hope that Jesus will somehow take the worst attempts of evil to destroy us. And all those efforts thrown at us will simply serve to produce a greater and more glorious resurrection in the end, when all things are put back together again. Every betrayal, every grief, every sleepless night, every tear, every pain, every separation, every divorce, every rejection, every crushed dream, every sickness, all undone in the new creation, all made new, all restored. If he can take Judas's betrayal and turn it to something beautiful, so can he with our lives. The story of Judas versus Jesus shows us that evil does not have the last word. Darkness does not last. The morning will come. And by the power of the Spirit in the here and now, when we face betrayal and brokenness, we can stand in faith. I'm not saying perfectly, I'm not saying not without doubt, but with confidence, because Jesus will complete the work he started in us. And we can sit in the grief. We can acknowledge the hurt and the pain and the brokenness around us. And we can know that Jesus is right there with us, weeping on the floor beside us, wrapping us in his arms. And as he dries our tears, we can step back into a broken world, inviting sinners back to the dinner table, eating with them like Christ ate with us. Knowing that when we will be hurt, because it will happen if you love like Christ loved, you'll be hurt, but he'll care for us. He'll take that hurt on himself and he'll redeem it. And through it all, day by day, moment by moment, in the darkest of nights, we can press on with hope, knowing that resurrection awaits. Night may be on the doorstep, but morning will come, and it will bring with it a glory that is greater than anything we could ever dream. This is the hope of the gospel.